The Loop by Dyani Sheppard. Breathe in for 2 and out for 2, one foot in front of the other. Push away from the pavement, feel the concrete rolling out behind you, taking small quick steps, quicker and quicker, another one. Keep it going, keep moving, keep running, gliding, almost there. Long trails of hot breath evaporated from Helen, released into the cool late afternoon. The Loop. Almost too late to be out alone. But Helen needed to run today. Work had been too much, and she needed an escape. She had inherited this habit from her mother, who ran every day before she got sick. She liked to think of her body as a machine, one built to run, her legs as pistons carrying her faster, further along the path. The path was quiet, a long winding strip of pavement disappearing into the distance ahead. Helen was in the zone now, leaving behind the day, its endless meetings and the intense focus they demanded. She felt far from the argument with Tom, the one they seemed to be having again and again. She felt weightless. A movement up ahead brought her back. She felt a prickle, suddenly aware of her isolation, darkness closing in. She thought of the female runner who had gone missing on the loop a few years ago. But it was just another jogger, a tall man in dark lycra. He ran straight past without acknowledgement, in the zone too. She continued, aware now she was chasing the last of the light. A wind stirred through the leafless branches and a rush of cool air hit Helen's face. Almost home. She passed under a domed tunnel, hearing a strange metallic creaking, very close. It followed her out of the tunnel. She expected a cyclist and moved to one side of the path, but none followed. At home, the evening fell into its familiar contours, dinner and TV and a silent truce. Helen stayed up too late watching a ridiculous reality show, and then lay in bed counting the hours of sleep remaining until her alarm would sound. She woke with a jolt in the deep of the night, the edges of sleep trailing away. That strange sense of having been elsewhere, somewhere unknown, somewhere just out of reach. Only a whisper remained. In the dark kitchen, she ran the tap, the glass cold in her hand. She stood at the sink looking out of the window into the still night. She took a sip of the icy midwinter water, feeling her way back to reality a little. A loud mechanical thunder erupted into the stillness, and the room was flooded with bright light, streaming in from the window, a roar of engine, driving onwards and onwards, a screech of metal. Helen's hands went to her head instinctively. The glass of water fell to the floor, her body tensed as she braced. She closed her eyes tightly and she felt the lights wash over her, and then blackness returned, silence restored. She didn't move. There was a creak above her, and slow, heavy footsteps softly thudded down the stairs, pausing midway. Another creak. "Helen?" Tom's voice was cautious. "I'm just getting some water. I'll be back up in a minute," she called in response. His presence seemed to have awoken her completely, and she moved carefully around the pool of wet and slivers of glass to fetch the dustpan and brush. It's the long hours, it's the training. The next day, Helen had a meeting with a local client. They had suggested this place, Station South it was called. She hadn't thought much of it, but now she sat here in the old train station building with its high ceilings, exposed wooden beams, large windows, and under all that vacant space she felt a niggling unease. Usually she caught a glimpse of this place as she ran beneath it, warm yellow light spilling onto the loop, the windows framing animated people, their voices soundless to Helen as she jogged past. It felt strange being up here, overlooking the loop. She should be down on the path, looking up. Old signs hanging on the walls nodded to the cafe's past life as a station. One black and white photo showed a clamour of commuters on a platform, long coats and tall hats, pressing toward a train. Their movement caused them to blur, trailing imprints of themselves. On this midweek morning, the cafe was quiet, and it wasn't hard to imagine the few lone customers with suitcases at their heels, anxiously glancing up at the clock, a sense of waiting lingering in the room. A small plaque next to the picture read, 23rd of November 1959, train crash at Slade Lane Junction, Levenshulme, Manchester. The Manchester to Bournemouth Pines Express, hauled by locomotive 45520 Llandudno, collided with the diesel-hauled Buxton Manchester service. 1 fatality, 4 injured. Slade Lane, that was only up the road. 1 fatality. A journey never completed. Were they going into Manchester for work or shopping or on the way home from further away? Had they been travelling alone? Or with their husband, mother, child? "Hi Helen, I'm sorry I'm late. I couldn't find anywhere to park." The client was here. Helen turned away from the plaque and resumed her seat at the wooden table, slipping into the world of numbers and taxes. That evening, Helen was back on the loop, retracing her familiar route, pounding away the pavement, pulling herself onwards. She settled into the flow, her body relaxing into the motions, her mind emptying. The path seemed busier this evening, which she felt oddly grateful for. She heard laughter and voices and the rolling of tyres on the tarmac, and a trio of cyclists glided by her. Then the quiet returned. In the stillness, she heard a gentle singing, a soft and high voice. It was a woman's voice, surely, but her words didn't carry. Helen faltered and slowed. The sound drifted away. She steadied herself and increased her pace once more. The voice came again, a language of unrecognizable sounds, but distinctly sorrowful, strangely beautiful, calling from somewhere along the deserted tree-lined corridor. She ran faster, but still the voice persisted. A humming echoed the voice's notes. The song again, a new line of melody. The humming mimicked. Then a girlish giggle. Brief but unmistakable, a child's delight. Helen closed her eyes for a moment, flying blind. After 10 minutes, she was forced to slow, a stitch beginning in her side. She tried to regain her breath, taking big inhales and exhales. She came to a stop beneath a bridge, its metalled underside rusting, brick walls tagged with graffiti and moss creeping up the edges, thriving in the wet shadows. There was the soft and constant drip of water falling. She paused and turned around, taking in the empty path behind her. The bridge shook and rattled with a train passing by overhead. Helen flinched for a second, before looking up to catch the end of the train. Still, her chest heaved, and she could feel her blood pulsing. A heavy gust of wind swept through the branches. A wave of coldness rushed over her. Having sprinted the final stretch of the run, Helen was back home while Tom hadn't yet returned. She caught her breath in the hallway, thankful she didn't have to speak to anyone. After an hour, Tom still hadn't returned. She texted him only to be reminded rather pointedly of his annual team conference in London, where he would be staying the night. Helen avoided silence for the rest of the night. She drew the curtains and switched on all the lights, turning the radio up, letting the voices babble away as she cooked and left it playing to compete with the TV. Upstairs, she played a podcast out loud, letting it blare into the room as she curled up under the duvet. Her legs ached from running, her body felt heavy, and she was hopeful sleep would come soon. She tried to focus on the vibrations of the voices cutting through the air. She took a deep breath and relaxed more deeply into the softness of the bed. But she was awake to hear the cheery podcasters sign off and their tinny voices cease, silence regaining the room. She tensed again, waiting for sleep. A murmuring began. Helen's breath stopped, her eyes opened, she held herself rigid. She listened intensely, not knowing whether she was praying for silence or something more. The melodic warbling floated through the darkness. A beam of light tore through the room and vanished. A distant mechanical whir sounded. She shivered under the heavy duvet. Her heart beat furiously, as if she was running and could barely keep up. A warm hand touched her shoulder. The world was slipping from under her. The hand lightly squeezed her shoulder, then moved to stroke her hair. The song filled the room. She felt soft fingers through her hair, gently tracing her scalp. A dull humming reverberated in response, light and tuneful. Her chest vibrated with it, as if it was her humming. The hand continued, steady and dutiful. She felt a tingle of pleasure at the back of her neck. Her breathing slowed, and the resistance drained out of her body. The loop again. The early morning dampness hung in the air, the path curving away into whiteness. Distant birds tweeted, and she caught the sounds of tyres on the wet roads above. Helen kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead, thinking only of her pace, counting 1, 2, 3, each step driving herself toward the next mile. 4, 5, 6, 7, determined to keep her mind on track. 8, 9, 10. The flat and smooth surface of the path hid all traces of the worn and rusted metal and wood structures that had once lain there. She began to lose herself in the action, no longer forcing each step, but taken over by the momentum. Her breath steadied and her mind stopped focusing on the aches of her legs. She drifted off, away from the loop. Last night floated to her once more. She ran faster and faster, away from Tom and their arguments, away from work. She ran faster than she ever had, her arms pumping, her breaths quick and rapid. Her chest split, her legs burned. She ran under a tunnel and heard it behind her. The mechanical creak, the incessant pants of steam, the thundering of heavy metal. She slowed her steps. Her chest heaved, fighting for air. There was a piercing whistle, a rush of air. She emerged from the tunnel and staggered to the edge of the path, forcing herself between the brambles, turning around to face the train which roared out of the darkness, its headlights temporarily blinding her. She found herself laughing, an unnatural and manic noise, breathless as she was. It was strangled, a rasping sound caught between her heavy breaths. There was a screech of metal against metal, unseen industrial manoeuvres drawing the train to a standstill. Steam billowed from beneath its carriages. Helen searched for figures emerging in the mist, but none came. She heard the voice, high and tuneful, an intangible, elusive warbling that drew her nearer. Then the humming. Her chest vibrated with it. She echoed the tune without thinking. She followed the voice, edging closer to the train. The door of a carriage was open. She hummed a response, eager to hear the soft voice again. It floated through the door. Helen pulled herself up to the steps, into the carriage. She was enveloped in its rumble. A wall of warmth met her. She hadn't realized she had been so cold, but her muscles loosened and a heat spread across her shoulders, drawing her in. A lone woman was sitting in the carriage, facing Helen, as if waiting. Her face was blank and featureless. Her greying hair was drawn away from her face. She wore a long plain dress that obscured her figure. Helen went to the woman without hesitation, sitting in the seat beside her. The woman made no reaction, simply turning to look out of the window. Her song filled the carriage. Helen laid her head on the woman's shoulder. The train began to move, gently picking up speed. They soared on smoothly down the endless path. Helen felt light and free. After all, she was small, and anything was still possible. Outside, the trees blurred into one, and Helen was taken away.
Ghosts at the Old Library, a series of 6 short stories by local writers Marie Crook, Nicholas Royal, Gaynor Jones, Dyani Sheppard, Lauren O'Donoghue and Joe Howard, Produced by Levenshulme Old Library and ALLFM. Music by Oscilloscope, made possible with funding from the Arts Council, and creative director Richard Hirst.